Yesterday, Mark Carney stood in front of the Economic Club of New York and delivered the most consequential trade address from a Canadian leader in a generation. He looked directly at Wall Street's most powerful institutional investors and reframed the entire economic relationship between Canada and the United States. He did not beg for exemptions, and he did not offer concessions. Instead, he deployed a single sentence calibrated to echo through both the boardrooms of Manhattan and the corridors of the West Wing. Canada Strong will help make America great again. This was not a routine piece of diplomatic rhetoric. This was a calculated, high-stakes counteroffensive launched precisely as North America approaches a structural economic precipice. On July 1st, 2026, just days away now, 3 countries must make a decision that changes everything. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement governs a trading relationship officially valued at $1.8 trillion every single year. That number translates into $2.5 billion in goods and services crossing the Canada-US border daily, confirmed by Ottawa itself. America has set its terms for renewing that deal, and Canada has publicly rejected the most important ones. The United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer published a list of demands he called structural conditions for any renewal. At the top of that list sits Canada's Dairy Supply Management System, a 50-year-old economic institution Carney calls untouchable. If you want to understand what is really at stake in this negotiation, subscribe to Money Signals right now. Hit that subscribe button because the financial consequences of this standoff will reach every business, every consumer, and every job connected to North America. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to understand what CUSMA actually is and what it does daily. CUSMA replaced the original North American Free Trade Agreement in July 2020, and it was always designed with a built-in pressure mechanism. The agreement included a mandatory 6-year review clause, a sunset provision that forces renewal negotiations exactly 6 years after signing. That review date is July 1st, 2026, and all 3 countries must confirm in writing whether they want 16 more years. If any one country declines to confirm renewal, a 10-year countdown clock begins ticking toward the deal's complete expiration in 2036. Trump called the deal transitional during his White House meeting with Carney, signaling he sees this review as a full renegotiation opportunity. That one word, transitional, told every trade lawyer, every supply chain executive, and every financial analyst exactly what was coming next. The US Trade Representative confirmed publicly that America would not treat this review as a routine sign-off under any circumstances. Greer told Congress in December 2025 that CUSMA had been successful to a certain degree, but structural shortcomings remained unresolved. He named Canada's Dairy Supply Management System as the first and most prominent structural issue requiring resolution before any extension could be confirmed. Canada's supply management system was established in the early 1970s, and it has survived every single trade negotiation since its creation. It operates through production quotas, which Canadian farmers must purchase, combined with tariffs exceeding 200% on dairy imports above set quotas. Under the existing CUSMA deal, American dairy producers were granted tariff-free access worth approximately 3.5% of Canada's domestic dairy market. The US dairy lobby has been pushing for years to expand that access significantly and now sees 2026 as their best opportunity. Greer specifically named 2 irritants: how Canada allocates existing tariff rate quotas for American dairy, and how Canadian producers price certain milk proteins. Carney looked at those demands directly during a press conference in December 2025 and said, "Supply management is not on the table." That sentence, short, calm, and completely unambiguous, was the most consequential trade statement any Canadian Prime Minister had made in years. Because it did not just reject a dairy demand, it rejected America's entire framing of what this review was supposed to accomplish. The US had positioned the CUSMA review as leverage, a mechanism to extract structural concessions from both Canada and Mexico simultaneously. Canada responded by treating the review as a checkpoint. Its own chief trade negotiator, Jean Charest, publicly called July 1st a checkpoint, not a cliff. That language difference between Washington and Ottawa tells you everything about how differently the two sides are approaching this negotiation strategically. Washington sees a deadline with consequences. Ottawa sees a process with options that extend well beyond any single calendar date. And Canada has a legal argument to support that position, one that CUSMA's own text confirms when read carefully by trade lawyers. Under the agreement's architecture, failure to renew does not terminate the deal on July 1st. It triggers annual reviews continuing until 2036. The Bank of Canada confirmed in its January 2026 Monetary Policy Report that a prolonged review scenario keeps CUSMA technically in force. That legal reality gives Canada room to say no to American terms without triggering immediate catastrophic trade disruption on July 1st, 2026. But legal protection and economic protection are two entirely different things. And the financial cost of prolonged uncertainty is already measurable in real data. Canada's automotive sector production declined 5.4% in 2025, with TD Economics directly attributing the decline to CUSMA uncertainty and tariff disruption. Canadian export volumes to the US fell 5.8% in 2025, led by vehicles, steel, aluminum and forestry products declining simultaneously. Canada's real GDP growth slowed to 1.7% in 2025, the weakest performance since the economy actually contracted in 2020. Every month of unresolved CUSMA uncertainty costs the Canadian economy measurable output. And the same is true for key American industries as well. The US exported $28 billion in agricultural products to Canada in 2025, a market American farmers cannot afford to lose under any scenario. 34 American states sell more goods to Canada than to any other foreign economy in the entire world, confirmed by TD Economics. That statistic rarely appears in American political coverage, but it defines why Canada actually holds more trade leverage than most analysts acknowledge publicly. When Greer demands structural concessions from Canada, he is simultaneously threatening the export markets of 34 American state economies dependent on Canadian consumers. The US-Canada trading relationship is not a one-way dependency. It is a deeply integrated two-way system where both sides absorb the consequences of any rupture. The automotive sector sits at the absolute center of this negotiation, and the numbers confirm exactly why that is true. In 2024, total automotive trade between Canada and the United States was valued at $152 billion annually. Canada exported $75 billion in vehicles and parts to America, while importing $77 billion in return every single year. The Canadian automotive sector directly supports over 125,000 jobs and contributed $16.8 billion to GDP in 2024 alone. 5 major manufacturers, Stellantis, Ford, General Motors, Toyota and Honda, anchor that sector through nearly 700 Canadian part suppliers nationwide. CUSMA requires that 75% of vehicle content must be North American for it to cross borders without facing tariffs. 40% of a passenger car's content must specifically be manufactured in either the United States or Canada to qualify for duty-free entry. For pickup trucks, that threshold rises to 45%, making American content requirements in Canadian assembly plants a structural operating condition. What makes this sector so critical to the CUSMA negotiations is a single data point confirmed by industry leaders publicly. American content in vehicles manufactured in Canada has increased from 38% under NAFTA in 2019 to 50% under CUSMA in 2024. Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association President Flavio Volpe confirmed that number publicly, calling it proof the deal has already delivered for American workers. Canada is the single largest destination for American auto parts exports in the entire world, receiving $29 billion annually. There are 176 Canadian-owned auto parts factories operating across 23 American states, employing 48,000 American workers directly. These are not statistics that exist only in Ottawa briefing notes. They are economic realities that affect real communities in swing states. When US negotiators demand tighter rules of origin or higher regional content thresholds, they are simultaneously threatening those 48,000 American factory jobs. The US International Trade Commission launched a formal investigation into CUSMA automotive rules of origin in February 2026, adding another layer of uncertainty. Major automakers, including General Motors, Ford, Tesla and Toyota, all publicly urged the Trump administration to extend CUSMA precisely because of this integration. Stellantis submitted a formal statement arguing that disrupting CUSMA rules would cause American vehicles to lose market share directly to Asian competitors. Every threat to tighten automotive rules is therefore simultaneously a threat to American auto sector competitiveness in its own domestic market against Japan and China. This reality transforms the automotive dossier from a tool of American leverage into a mutual hostage situation, where a single miscalculation by Washington negotiators could detonate supply chains in their own industrial heartland. But as the clock ticks closer to the July 1st deadline, the most consequential question remains unanswered. To answer that question, we have to look past the political theatre and dissect the hidden architecture of CUSMA itself. Specifically, how a conflict over streaming services and cultural sovereignty is being leveraged to target Canada's most critical industrial assets. The streaming and digital services battle adds an entirely separate dimension to the negotiations that is equally explosive in diplomatic terms. US Trade Representative Greer publicly named Canada's Online Streaming Act, which governs platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube, as a formal trade irritant requiring resolution. The CRTC moved in May 2026 to triple the contribution that streaming platforms must make toward funding Canadian-produced programming content domestically. That decision drew an immediate response from the Motion Picture Association. Its chairman called it a burdensome framework that unfairly targets global streaming companies. The association's statement directly claimed the CRTC's decision violates Canada's obligations under CUSMA, turning a cultural policy decision into a live trade dispute. Canada's CUSMA text includes a cultural industries exception that technically allows Ottawa to protect its broadcasting sector from external commercial pressure. However, trade law experts warn that invoking that exception grants the United States the right to retaliate against any other Canadian sector it chooses. The legal mechanism transforms a Netflix contribution dispute into a potential tariff threat on Canadian lumber, steel, or agricultural exports with zero connection to streaming. Carney acknowledged the streaming issue publicly, but framed it within a much larger bilateral conversation rather than treating it as a standalone negotiating concession. To understand how Washington is systematically exploiting this legal architecture to isolate Ottawa, we must look at the precise sequencing of the negotiating rounds throughout May 2026. The Globe and Mail confirmed, as of May 28, 2026, that Canada was not at the table for the first formal CUSMA negotiating rounds. Instead, US negotiators were meeting Mexican counterparts in Mexico City for 2 formal rounds of bilateral talks. While Canada's official start date for negotiations remained unset, Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc was scheduled to fly to Washington in early June 2026 to resume discussions following a 1-hour video meeting with Greer on May 26th. Canada's position entering those talks was stated clearly by Carney. The most important priority remains the removal of US sectoral tariffs before any broader deal is signed. Existing tariffs of 25% on Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian energy, and 50% on Canadian steel and aluminum all remain active. Canada lifted its own retaliatory tariffs on most US goods in September 2025 in recognition of CUSMA exemptions, but maintained tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. This tariff architecture creates a paradox. Both countries are operating inside CUSMA's framework while simultaneously violating its spirit through active sectoral duties on key industries. When we strip away the diplomatic talking points, the strategic design of this negotiation breaks down into 3 distinct structural components that define exactly how the leverage is being deployed on the Continental chessboard. First, Washington is executing a deliberate strategy of bilateral sequencing. By conducting 2 full rounds of negotiations exclusively with Mexico in Mexico City while leaving Ottawa off the schedule, the United States Trade Representative is attempting to fracture the trilateral front. The objective is to secure baseline concessions from Mexico on labour standards and rules of origin first, thereby establishing a new baseline that Canada will be forced to accept later. This bilateral isolation is designed to induce panic in Ottawa, signalling that the United States is entirely comfortable pursuing a hub-and-spoke trade model rather than a unified North American bloc. Second, The structural vulnerability of Canada's regulatory landscape has been weaponized through the cross-sectoral retaliation clauses embedded within CUSMA. The United States is intentionally pairing Canada's domestic regulatory choices, specifically the CRTC's May 2026 decision to triple streaming levies with traditional trade commodities. Under Article 32.6 of the agreement, Canada's invocation of the cultural exemption does not stop American retaliation. It legally legitimizes it. Washington's playbook is not to litigate digital services in a vacuum, but to use the financial pain of global tech firms to justify immediate punitive tariffs on Canadian raw materials, forcing Canadian industrial lobbies to pressure their own government for a regulatory retreat. Third, the unresolved tariff matrix acts as a coercive economic enforcement mechanism. The active duties of 25% on generalized goods, 10% on energy, and up to 50% on metals are functioning as an active tax on Canadian competitiveness while negotiations occur. By maintaining these measures despite Canada lifting its own generalized retaliatory tariffs in September 2025, Washington has established an asymmetrical environment. The American negotiating team is treating the status quo as a penalty box for Canada, ensuring that every week the deal remains unrenewed. The Canadian Treasury and private sector absorb a compounding financial drain that the United States economy barely registers. At the Economic Club of New York, Carney directly addressed this paradox with language calibrated for both Wall Street and Washington simultaneously. He called for a new partnership and framed Canada's position around mutual strength and deeper integration, offering cooperation rather than confrontation as a negotiating posture. He explicitly signalled openness to deeper cooperation in automobiles, steel and aluminum, sectors where both countries have legitimate shared interests in resisting Asian competition. Carney said directly, "Canada Strong will help make America great again," reframing Canadian economic resilience as an American interest, not an American threat. That message was specifically designed to give American business leaders a financial reason to push Washington toward a deal, rather than toward continued escalation in tariff warfare. The business community on both sides of the border has been calculating the cost of prolonged uncertainty for months, and the numbers are deeply alarming. The Bank of Canada confirmed in January 2026 that an unfavourable CUSMA outcome would weaken Canadian export competitiveness, reduce production, investment, hiring, and economic output simultaneously. For America, 34 states losing their largest export market would carry consequences no administration could absorb politically heading into a midterm election environment. Goldie Hyder, president of the Business Council of Canada, made the sharpest observation of all about this negotiation when he addressed the urgency publicly. He said that the people being casual about the July timeline simply do not run a profit and loss statement every single day of the week. That observation captures what makes this standoff so financially dangerous. The people with the most to lose are not the ones sitting at the negotiating table. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on these shifting dynamics, because the underlying structural numbers reveal a reality that completely contradicts the public rhetoric coming out of Washington. The legal mechanics of CUSMA mean that a failure to sign on July 1st does not instantly collapse continental trade. Rather, it shifts the entire relationship into a volatile regulatory grey zone. According to internal Trade Ministry assessments, entering the annual review cycle would freeze long-term corporate investment across the Windsor-Detroit corridor almost immediately, while the deal technically remains alive. The threat of a rolling 10-year sunset creates an unquantifiable risk premium for institutional capital. This brings us to the core strategic vulnerability that Ottawa is trying to mask with its legal arguments about checkpoints versus cliffs. The United States knows that Canada's economic growth is structurally dependent on trade certainty with its southern neighbour, and Washington is betting that the Canadian domestic political consensus will fracture before the American export engine feels the squeeze. Yet, by forcing a structural confrontation over legacy systems like dairy supply management alongside modern digital frameworks, the United States may have miscalculated the domestic political reality inside Canada, where surrender on these specific fronts is viewed as an existential threat to national sovereignty. The architecture of the deal has set a trap, but it remains entirely uncertain who will walk into it first. The fundamental takeaway from the opening moves of this trade standoff is that Washington is treating the upcoming July 1st CUSMA review as an offensive tool to force structural concessions out of Ottawa, while Canada is using the agreement's complex legal architecture to buy time, absorb tariff pressure, and refuse to bargain away its national sovereignty. But when you lift your eyes from the immediate details of the auto parts registries and dairy quotas, the view from the crow's nest reveals that this negotiation is not merely about trade balances. It is about the complete re-engineering of the economic relationship between Canada and the United States, carrying massive implications for global alliances, continental security, and the future of North American industrial policy. To fully understand how profound this shift is, you have to contrast the current environment under the Carney administration with the pre-Trump era of the early 2010s. A decade ago, Canada-US trade negotiations operated under a predictable framework of institutional orthodoxy. Both sides accepted that the ultimate goal was the mutual lowering of barriers, the expansion of absolute trade volumes, and the adherence to rules-based international mechanisms like the World Trade Organization. Today, that world is entirely gone. We have transitioned from an era of relationship-driven diplomacy to a transactional landscape where national security and economic protectionism are inextricably linked. Trade is no longer viewed as a mutually beneficial tide that lifts all boats, but as a zero-sum theatre of geopolitical competition. This structural transformation alters three major arenas of the bilateral relationship simultaneously. The first major shift occurs in the defense and critical minerals sector. Washington is explicitly trying to construct what policymakers call Fortress North America, a secure, integrated supply chain for the inputs required to run a high-tech economy and a modern military machine without relying on adversaries. Canada holds an undeniable advantage here, possessing vast reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite. But the price of admission to this secure continental market, from the American perspective, is structural subordination. When Carney travelled to New York, his message was designed to reframe this dynamic entirely. By offering deeper integration in critical minerals, steel and aluminum, Ottawa is pitching Canada as a vital security asset rather than an economic competitor. The strategy is to embed Canadian resources so deeply into the American defense industrial base that disrupting trade becomes a direct threat to US national security itself. CTV News' the second critical arena is the energy matrix. As the United States experience an exponential surge in power demand, driven heavily by the rapid expansion of artificial intelligence data centers and industrial electrification, their energy security is increasingly tethered to Canadian infrastructure. This is what Carney meant when he reminded Wall Street that Canadian electricity exports are the energy equivalent of 10 Hoover dams. In the pre-Trump era, Canadian energy was often treated by Washington as an environmental debate or a convenient commodity buffer. In the current geopolitical climate, it is a primary strategic vulnerability for the United States. If Washington chose to choke off the broader CUSMA framework, they would simultaneously jeopardize the very grid stability required to fuel their domestic technological expansion. Global News' the third arena is the realignment of global alliances and trade diversification. For half a century, Canada's economic playbook was simple: maintain seamless access to the American market at almost any cost. The aggressive use of sectoral tariffs by the Trump administration has forced a permanent evolution in Ottawa's strategic thinking. By successfully negotiating 20 new trade agreements with rapidly growing economies like India, Indonesia, and the United Arab Emirates, Canada has demonstrated that it is no longer a captive market. These alternative export pathways have allowed the Canadian economy to absorb a $29 billion decline in US exports while leading the G7 in per capita direct investment inflows. The long-term implication is clear. Canada is actively reducing its one-sided dependency on the United States, transforming itself from a vulnerable economic satellite into a more resilient, multipolar trading hub. 650 CCOM, make sure you're subscribed to Money Signals and hit that like button right now, because as we track these massive tectonic shifts, The actual timeline of this negotiation is about to collide with a volatile political calendar. The strategy behind Ottawa's calculated stubbornness relies entirely on the passage of time. Canadian officials are fully aware that the United States is heading directly into a high-stakes midterm election environment this autumn. By treating the July 1st date as a routine checkpoint rather than a hard deadline, Canada is deliberately pushing the true climax of these talks into the late autumn. The political calculation is simple, but incredibly risky. The current American administration cannot afford to trigger widespread supply chain chaos, factory shutdowns in swing states, or sudden grocery price spikes for agricultural products right before voters head to the ballot box. Ottawa is betting that, as the election approaches, Washington's appetite for a destructive trade war will diminish, forcing American negotiators to accept a cleaner extension of the existing deal. But this high-stakes geopolitical poker game leaves the Canadian economy operating in a prolonged state of manufactured uncertainty. While the legal text of CUSMA ensures that the trade gates will not slam shut on July 1st, the lack of a formal 16-year renewal acts as a persistent drag on capital allocation. Every month that passes without written confirmation from all three nations increases the risk premium for institutional investors. The Bank of Canada remains trapped in an impossible monetary policy vice, forced to maintain its overnight rate at 2.25% to combat persistent inflation while watching domestic manufacturing investment stall. The strategy has been set. The defensive lines have been drawn, and the financial markets have already priced in the opening rounds of this Continental standoff. Canada has proven it can absorb the initial economic salvos with far more resilience than mainstream analysts predicted, but endurance is not a permanent solution. As Minister LeBlanc prepares to land in Washington for the first direct face-to-face ministerial talks since the negotiation effectively stalled, the entire framework of North American economic integration is about to be tested. The immediate legal trap of the sunset clause has been avoided, but the ultimate question of whether two deeply integrated neighbours can find a path to mutual prosperity without demanding structural surrender remains entirely open. The clock is ticking toward July 1st, but the truly decisive battle for the economic sovereignty of the continent will be fought in the shadow of the American midterms.